Imagine this. You're sitting in your favorite chair, sipping your morning coffee, watching the world go by outside your window. The years have crept up on you, and now, past 65, you start to wonder, how much time do I really have left? It's a question that lingers in the back of your mind, one we all push away until something forces us to face it. For Clara Thompson, a 68-year-old retired elementary school teacher from the quiet suburbs of Chicago, that moment came on an ordinary Tuesday morning in the fall of 2025. And let me tell you, her story might just make you look at your own life or the lives of those you love a little differently. Clara wasn't the kind of woman who chased after big dreams or lived a flashy life. She'd spent 35 years teaching third graders how to read, write, and dream a little bigger, her soft voice and warm smile a constant in their little worlds. After retiring 3 years ago, she traded her chalkboard for a small garden in her backyard, where she'd spend hours tending to her roses and marigolds. Her life was simple, cozy sweaters, a cup of chamomile tea at night, and the occasional phone call from her daughter, Emily, who lived 2 hours away in Milwaukee. But lately, something felt off. Clara couldn't quite put her finger on it. Her steps felt heavier when she walked to the mailbox. Her hands trembled just a little when she tried to prune her flowers. She brushed it off as just getting older after all. Isn't that what everyone says happens past 65? But deep down, a quiet unease was starting to bloom, like a weed she couldn't pull out. It all came to a head one crisp October morning. Clara was sitting at her kitchen table, the sunlight streaming through the window and casting golden patches on her worn wooden floor. She'd just finished watering her plants when she decided to flip through a magazine she'd picked up at the grocery store, some health journal she'd grabbed on a whim. That's when she saw it. A headline in bold letters that stopped her cold. 8 subtle signs your body reveals how long you'll live past 65, backed by science from Harvard. Her heart skipped a beat. Harvard? That's not some tabloid nonsense, that's the real deal. She adjusted her glasses, leaned closer, and started reading. The article promised to reveal the tiny, everyday clues your body gives you about how many years you might have left, clues most people miss until it's too late. Walking speed, grip strength, sleep patterns, balance, things she'd never thought twice about. Suddenly, her cozy little world felt a lot less certain. Clara set the magazine down and stared out the window at her garden. The roses swayed gently in the breeze, but her mind was racing. Could my body really be telling me something I don't want to hear? She wondered. She thought about her life, about the years she'd spent shaping young minds, the quiet evenings alone since her husband, Tom, passed 5 years ago, the way she'd started to feel more tired than she used to. At 68, she wasn't ancient, but she wasn't young either. She'd always assumed she'd live into her 80s, maybe even her 90s, like her grandmother who'd made it to 92 with a sharp mind and a stubborn streak. But what if she was wrong? What if her body was already whispering secrets she hadn't learned to listen to? Let's paint the picture of Clara's life a little more vividly. Her home was a modest 2-bedroom house on a tree-lined street, the kind of place where neighbors wave but don't linger too long. The walls were lined with faded photos: her wedding day with Tom, Emily's high school graduation, a snapshot of Clara holding a Teacher of the Year plaque in 2005. Her garden was her pride and joy, a splash of color against the gray Midwestern winters. She'd spent countless hours out there, kneeling in the dirt, coaxing life from the soil. But lately, those hours had gotten shorter. She'd catch herself pausing halfway through, her knees aching, her breath a little shallow. She'd laugh it off to herself, "Clara, you're not 40 anymore." But now, with that magazine staring up at her, those little moments didn't feel so funny. The Harvard article stuck with her like a song she couldn't shake. It wasn't just some fluffy self-help piece, it was grounded in research, years of data collected from people just like her. Scientists had tracked thousands of seniors, looking for patterns, and found that subtle changes in your body after 65 could predict how long you'd stick around. Not big, obvious things like heart attacks or cancer, but quiet shifts the way you move, the way you rest, the way you hold on to the world. Clara's hands tightened around her coffee mug. She wasn't a scientist, but she'd always trusted facts. Back in her teaching days, she drilled into her students the importance of evidence. Don't just believe something because it sounds nice. Prove it. And here was Harvard, telling her the proof might be right there in her own skin. She stood up, a little slower than she liked, and walked to the mirror in her hallway. Her reflection stared back, graying hair pulled into a loose bun, a few more lines around her eyes than she remembered, a softness in her cheeks that hadn't been there a decade ago. She didn't look sick. She didn't feel like she was falling apart. But as she studied herself, she couldn't help but wonder, what if I'm missing something? What if my body's been trying to tell me how much time I have left, and I've just been too busy watering my roses to notice? It was a chilling thought, one that made her stomach twist and her chest tighten. She wasn't ready to think about the end. Not yet. She still had plans, trips she wanted to take with Emily, books she wanted to read, a whole garden to tend. But what if those plans were running out of time? Clara's mind flashed to her friend Margaret, who lived a few blocks away. Margaret was 72, spry as ever, always out walking her dog or chatting with neighbors. Then there was Bill, another old colleague from the school, who'd slowed down so much in the last year that he barely left his house anymore. Both were older than 65, but their lives looked so different. Was it just luck? Or was there something deeper at play, something science could explain? The article had promised 8 signs, and Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to know them. Not just for herself, but for Emily, for her friends, for anyone who'd ever wondered if the years ahead were a gift or a gamble. She sat back down at the table, her coffee now lukewarm, and picked up the magazine again. Her hands trembled slightly, not enough to drop it, but enough to notice. Was that one of the signs? She didn't know yet, but she was about to find out. The truth was, Clara had always been a problem solver. When a kid in her class struggled with spelling, she'd find a way to make it fun. When Tom got sick, she'd researched every treatment she could find. Now it was her turn to figure something out, not just for curiosity's sake, but because the stakes felt higher than ever. If my body's talking, she thought, I'd better start listening. So here's the question for you. Have you ever stopped to wonder what your body's trying to tell you? Maybe you've noticed a little change, a slower step, a weaker grip, a restless night, and brushed it off like Clara did. Or maybe you've seen it in someone you love, those quiet shifts that creep in after 65. The science says those signs aren't random, they're clues, backed by years of research, pointing to how long you might have left. Clara didn't know it yet, but she was about to uncover 8 of them, and what she found would change everything. Her story's just beginning, and trust me, you'll want to stick around to see where it leads. Clara Thompson stood in her kitchen, the magazine still open on the table, its bold headlines staring up at her like a challenge. 8 subtle signs your body reveals, how long you'll live past 65, backed by science from Harvard. Her coffee had gone cold, but she didn't care. That morning in October 2025, something had shifted inside her. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was a need to know. If her body was sending signals about how much time she had left, she wasn't going to sit there and ignore them. She grabbed a notepad and a pen, the same ones she used to jot down lesson plans back in her teaching days, and decided to take this seriously. Let's see what I'm dealing with, she muttered to herself, her voice steady but her heart racing. She started with the basics, things she could check right then and there. The first sign the article mentioned was walking speed. According to a study from the Journal of the American Medical Association JAMA, people over 65 who walk slower than 0.8 meters per second, about 2.6 feet, tend to have a shorter life expectancy. Clara frowned. She wasn't exactly timing herself with a stopwatch, but she knew her trips to the mailbox weren't what they used to be. She decided to test it. She slipped on her worn sneakers, stepped out her front door, and walked the 50 feet to the end of her driveway. The crisp fall air bit at her cheeks as she moved, her steps deliberate but heavier than she remembered. Halfway there, she felt a slight strain in her knees, a little catch in her breath. By the time she reached the mailbox, she wasn't panting, but she wasn't breezing along like her neighbor Margaret either. Am I really that slow? She wondered, glancing back at her house. The truth hit her like a cold wind. She wasn't keeping up anymore. Back inside, Clara scribbled walking speed on her notepad and underlined it. The article said it wasn't just about legs, it was about everything working together. Muscles, heart, lungs, even her brain. A slow pace could mean her whole system was starting to wind down. She didn't like that thought one bit. She'd always prided herself on being active, chasing kids around the classroom, hauling gardening soil in her wheelbarrow. But now, at 68, she couldn't deny it. Her stride had lost its spark. She sat back in her chair, staring at the words she'd written. Okay, Clara, she told herself, 1 down, 7 to go. Next up was grip strength. The magazine cited research from the National Institutes of Health (NIH) showing that a weak grip in your 60s and 70s is a red flag for overall decline, muscle loss, poor circulation, even a higher risk of falls. Clara's mind flashed to the jar of strawberry jam she'd struggled with yesterday. She'd twisted and twisted, her knuckles whitening, until she finally gave up and ate her toast plain. That's just a sticky lid, she'd told herself then, but now it felt like more. She got up, walked to the pantry, and grabbed that same jar. With a deep breath, she gripped it tight and turned. Her hands shook slightly, the lid resisted, and after a few seconds, she set it down, defeated again. Her heart sank. This isn't just about jam, she whispered. The NIH said a firm grip meant vitality, a body still fighting to stay strong. Hers was slipping, and she hadn't even noticed until now. She added grip strength to her list, her pen pressing harder into the paper. 2 signs in, and Clara was starting to feel a knot in her stomach. These weren't big, dramatic warnings like chest pain or dizzy spells, they were quiet, sneaky little shifts she'd brushed off as normal aging. But the science didn't lie. She flipped the page and read on sleep patterns. A 2023 study from the American Academy of Sleep Medicine linked poor sleep after 65 to a higher risk of heart disease, memory loss, and a shorter lifespan. Clara thought about her nights lately, tossing and turning, waking up at 3 a.m. to stare at the ceiling, feeling groggy even after 8 hours in bed. She used to sleep like a rock, but now, her chamomile tea wasn't cutting it anymore. She'd wake up to the sound of her own creaky house, her mind buzzing with nothing in particular, and stumble through the day half awake. That's 3, she said aloud, jotting it down. Her body wasn't resting like it should, and the article made it clear. That wasn't just annoying, it was a warning. The 4th sign hit closer to home: balance. The Harvard researchers had found that people over 65 who couldn't stand on one leg for at least 10 seconds were more likely to face falls, injuries, and even early death. Clara's garden flashed into her mind. Just last week, she tried to step over a row of marigolds to reach a weed, lifting 1 foot off the ground. She'd wobbled, her arms flailing like a windmill, and nearly toppled into the dirt. She'd laughed it off then. Clara, you're no gymnast. But now it didn't feel funny. She stood up from the table, determined to test it. In the middle of her kitchen, with the fridge humming softly in the background, she lifted her right leg. 1 second, 2, 3. Her left knee buckled, and she grabbed the counter to steady herself. 5 seconds, tops, she muttered, shaking her head. She wrote balance on her list, her handwriting shaky from more than just the effort. 4 signs in, and Clara's cozy little world was starting to feel like a puzzle she didn't want to solve. Walking speed, grip strength, sleep, balance, each one was a thread pulling at the fabric of her life, unraveling the confidence she'd held onto since retirement. She wasn't a hypochondriac, she wasn't rushing to the doctor over every ache, but this wasn't about aches. This was about her body whispering truths she'd ignored. She sat there, staring at her notepad, The ink smudged where her hand had brushed it. What if I've been missing these signs for years? She thought. What if it's already too late? Here's where I want to pause and bring you into this. Have you ever noticed these things in yourself or someone you love? Maybe your steps feel a little slower on your morning walk, or you've struggled with a stubborn jar lid more than once. Maybe your nights aren't as restful as they used to be, or you've caught yourself wobbling when you bend down. If you're still with me, I'd love to know you're here. Drop a 2 in the comments below to let me know you're following Clara's journey with me. It's not just her story, it could be yours, or your mom's, or your grandpa's. These signs aren't loud, but they're real, and the science says they matter. Clara didn't stop there, though. She couldn't. She'd spent her life teaching kids to face problems head-on, and she wasn't about to back down now. She picked up the magazine again, her hands steadier this time, and kept reading. The article promised 8 signs, and she'd only uncovered 4. She thought about her daughter, Emily, who'd be visiting next month. What would Emily think if she saw her mom slowing down, fumbling, fading? Clara didn't want that, not for herself, not for her family. She wanted to be the woman who still danced around her kitchen to old Motown records, who could kneel in her garden without a second thought. But as she sat there, the weight of those 4 signs pressed down on her. They weren't just random quirks, they were clues, backed by years of research, pointing to how long she might have left. The kitchen grew quiet, save for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Clara's roses swayed outside, oblivious to the storm brewing in her mind. She'd always thought aging was just a number, a badge of honor for a life well lived. But now she wasn't so sure. For more signs waited in those pages, and she had a feeling they'd hit even harder. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what came next. If I'm going to fight this, she thought, I need to know the whole truth. And trust me, what she found next would turn her world upside down, but it might just save it, too. Clara Thompson sat at her kitchen table, the notepad in front of her now a battlefield of scribbled words. Walking speed, grip strength, sleep, balance. Each one felt like a tiny crack in the life she'd built, a life she'd thought was steady as her roses outside. It was still that crisp October day in 2025, but the sunlight filtering through her window didn't feel warm anymore. It felt like a spotlight, exposing truths she wasn't ready to face. For signs down, for to go. The magazine from the grocery store, with its Harvard-backed promises, lay open beside her, daring her to keep going. Clara's hands hovered over the page. She didn't want to read on, but she couldn't stop. If I'm in this deep, she thought, I might as well see it through. She flipped to the next sign, energy levels. The article cited a 2021 study from the National Institute on Aging NIA, showing that persistent fatigue after 65 beyond, just feeling tired after a long day, could signal a body slowing down faster than it should. Clara's mind raced back over the past few months. She used to spend whole afternoons in her garden, pruning, planting, humming old tunes under her breath. Now, she'd barely make it through an hour before sinking into her porch chair, her chest heavy, her eyes drooping. She'd told herself it was the weather, the seasons changing, anything but her. But last week, she'd fallen asleep mid-afternoon, right there on the porch, the watering can still in her lap. She'd woken up to a chilly dusk, disoriented, her roses blurred in the fading light. That's not normal, she whispered, her voice trembling. She wrote energy on her list, the pen digging into the paper. 5 signs now, and the knot in her stomach tightened. The 6th sign was a gut punch, ability to handle stress. Research from Stanford University, published in 2024, had found that chronic stress after 65 doesn't just wear on your mind, it shortens your telomeres, those little caps on your DNA that protect your cells from aging. Shorter telomeres, shorter life. Clara thought about the power outage 2 nights ago. It was nothing big, just a flicker of lights, a hum of silence as the fridge shut off. But she'd snapped, pacing her dark kitchen, muttering about the electric company, her heart pounding long after the lights came back on. She used to shrug off little things like that. Years of managing rowdy third graders had made her unflappable. Now, a blown fuse felt like a personal attack. She rubbed her temples, remembering how she'd barely slept that night, her mind stuck on repeat. Stress, she wrote, her handwriting jagged. 6 signs, and each one peeled back another layer of denial. Next came appetite and weight changes. The article pointed to a CDC report from 2023. Unintentional weight loss after 65, especially tied to a fading appetite, often meant the body wasn't absorbing nutrients right, or worse, was shutting down. Clara's fork froze in her memory. She used to love her homemade chicken pot pie, the flaky crust and warm gravy, a comfort on chilly nights. But lately, she'd pick at it, pushing half the plate away, her stomach full after a few bites. She dropped a dress size since spring. Her favorite blue sweater hung loose on her shoulders now, but she'd chalked it up to eating lighter. Standing up, she walked to the fridge, opened it, and stared at the leftovers she hadn't touched in days. When did I stop being hungry? She wondered aloud. The scale in her bathroom confirmed it. 10 pounds gone since June. She scribbled appetite on her list, her breath catching. 7 signs, and the picture was getting clearer and darker. The 8th sign was the hardest to face. Social connections. The CDC had stark numbers. Loneliness after 65 increases your risk of early death by 50%. Strong ties, friends, family, community keep your brain sharp, your heart steady, your body fighting. Clara's house grew quiet in her mind. Since Tom passed, she'd let her world shrink. Her old teaching friends had drifted, some moved away, others got busy with grandkids. She hadn't been to the local book club in years, the one she'd helped start back in the 90s. Emily called, sure, but Clara hadn't seen her in months. Last weekend, she'd waved at Margaret walking her dog but stayed on her porch, too tired to chat. I'm fine alone, she'd always said, tending her garden in solitude. But now, staring at that empty fridge, the silence of her home pressed in like a weight. She wrote social on her list, her hand shaking so much the word blurred. 8 signs. 8 quiet whispers she'd ignored. Clara set the pen down and stood up, her legs wobbly, not from balance this time, but from the flood of realization crashing over her. She walked to the hallway mirror, the same one she'd faced that morning, and looked hard. The woman staring back wasn't the Clara she knew. Her eyes were dull, her cheeks sunken, her shoulders slouched under that too big sweater. When did this happen? She asked her reflection, her voice breaking. The garden outside was thriving, reds and yellows bursting against the gray sky, but inside, she was wilting. 8 signs, all there in plain sight. Her slow walk, her weak hands, her restless nights, her wobbly stance, her fading energy, her frayed nerves, her shrinking appetite, her lonely days. They weren't random, they were a map, and it was leading somewhere she didn't want to go. Her mind spun with what ifs. What if she'd noticed sooner? What if she'd kept up with Margaret, pushed through the fatigue, fought the stress? What if she'd paid attention when her body first whispered instead of shouting now? She thought of Emily, her bright-eyed daughter who'd always seen her as unbreakable. What would Emily say if she saw her mom like this, tired, fragile, fading? Clara's chest tightened, a sob catching in her throat. She wasn't ready to be that woman, the one who slows down, who disappears, who leaves her roses to someone else. But standing there, all 68 years of her life staring back, she couldn't deny it. Her body was telling her time was slipping away. Then came the turning point. Clara straightened up, her jaw tightening. No, she said aloud, her voice cutting through the silence. I'm not done yet. She wasn't a quitter. She'd taught kids to read when everyone said they couldn't. She'd held Tom's hand through chemo when hope was a thread. She'd built this life, her garden, her home, her memories, and she wasn't letting it go without a fight. The magazine wasn't just a warning, it was a wake-up call. Those 8 signs weren't a death sentence, they were a challenge. If science could spot them, maybe science could fix them too. She grabbed her notepad, tore off the scribbled page, and started a new one. "What I can do," she wrote at the top, underlining it twice. She thought about her garden again, how she'd nursed weak plants back to life with water, sunlight, care. If I can do that for my roses, she thought, I can do it for myself. The article had hinted at solutions, small changes, practical steps. She didn't need to be a scientist or a doctor, she just needed to start. Her hands might shake, her steps might falter, but she'd faced tougher odds before. She glanced at the phone on the counter, picturing Emily's voice on the other end. She imagined Margaret's dog wagging its tail, the book club laughing over coffee. There was still life out there and in her if she'd fight for it. Clara took a deep breath, the first steady one all day. The mirror still showed a woman who'd been blindsided, but now it showed something else. Resolve. 8 signs had shaken her to her core, but they'd also lit a fire. She didn't know how much time she had left, no one does, but she wasn't going to let it slip away without a say. The storm in her mind cleared, replaced by a quiet, fierce determination. She was Clara Thompson, gardener, teacher, survivor, and she was ready to rewrite her story one step, one grip, one night at a time. Clara Thompson stood in her hallway, the mirror reflecting a woman who just faced the hardest truths of her life. It was still that October day in 2025, but the air in her modest Chicago suburb home felt different now, charged with something new. The notepad on her kitchen table bore a fresh page, the words "what I can do" scrawled across the top in bold, determined strokes. 8 subtle signs had shaken her to her core: walking speed, grip strength, sleep, balance, energy, stress, appetite, social connections, but they'd also sparked a fire. At 68, Clara wasn't ready to fade into the background of her own story. She'd tended her roses through harsh winters, taught kids to believe in themselves, held her family together when it mattered most. If her body was whispering warnings, she'd whisper back, "Not yet." She started small, right where she stood. Walking speed had been the first sign, so she decided to fight it head-on. The Journal of the American Medical Association had hinted that regular movement could rebuild what age had worn down. Clara laced up her sneakers again, stepped outside, and walked to the mailbox, then kept going. Down the block, past Margaret's house, to the little park at the end of her street. Her knees grumbled, her breath puffed in the cool air, but she pushed on, counting her steps. 1, 2, 3, she muttered, her pace uneven but stubborn. By the time she looped back, sweat beaded on her forehead, and a small grin tugged at her lips. It wasn't fast, but it was a start. She'd read that 30 minutes a day could boost her speed and her lifespan. "I'll get there," she promised herself, imagining the roses cheering her on. Grip strength came next. Clara remembered the NIH study linking a firm grip to vitality, and that stubborn jam jar still sat in her pantry, mocking her. She didn't have fancy equipment, but she had a tennis ball from Tom's old stash in the garage. She sat on her porch that afternoon, squeezing it 5 times, 10, 20, her hands trembling at first, then steadying. The sun dipped low, painting the sky orange, and she kept going, picturing the day she'd twist that lid off without a fight. A 2022 article from the Journal of Gerontology said grip exercises could rebuild muscle in weeks. Clara didn't know if she'd see weeks or years, but she'd take every victory she could get. "This is for you, Emily," she thought, imagining her daughter's proud smile. Sleep was trickier, but Clara was determined. The American Academy of Sleep Medicine had tied poor rest to a shorter life, and her restless nights were proof she needed change. She dug into a Yale study from 2024 that swore by natural light, get it in the morning, and your body resets its clock. The next day, she threw open her curtains at dawn, letting the pale light flood her bedroom. She sipped her coffee outside, the chill waking her senses, And that night, she skipped the late TV. Instead, she brewed chamomile tea, turned off her phone, and slipped into bed by 10. She still woke once, but the ceiling didn't taunt her as long. Over days, the grogginess faded. 7 hours, she noted one morning, feeling a clarity she'd missed. Sleep wasn't just rest, it was her body rebuilding, and she'd claim it back. Balance had nearly toppled her in the garden, but Clara wasn't letting it win. Harvard's research said 10 seconds on one leg meant longer life, so she turned it into a game. In her kitchen, she'd lift a foot while washing dishes 3 seconds, then 5, then 8. She wobbled, laughed, kept going. Then she found a local yoga class on YouTube, free for seniors, led by a cheerful instructor from California. The first tree pose sent her tumbling onto the couch, but by week 2, she held it 10 seconds, then 15. Her roses watched through the window as she stood taller, steadier. Take that, she grinned, imagining the science nodding in approval. Balance wasn't just about standing, it was about resilience, and she was growing it back. Energy levels had dragged her down, but Clara saw a thread to pull. The NIA study suggested small bursts of activity could recharge an aging body. She started dancing, yes, dancing in her living room to Motown hits she'd loved since the 70s. Marvin Gaye's voice filled the house as she swayed, her hips stiff but loosening. 5 minutes became 10, then 20. She'd collapse into her chair, breathless but alive, the heaviness lifting. She added garden walks, short but frequent, feeling the dirt under her shoes, the sun on her face. "I'm not napping today," she declared one afternoon, pruning her marigolds with a vigor she'd thought was gone. Energy wasn't just youth, it was fuel, and she was stoking the fire. Stress had frayed her nerves, but Stanford's telomere research gave her a weapon: calm. Clara tried mindfulness, something she'd scoffed at before. She sat on her porch, eyes closed, breathing deep 5 seconds in, 5 out. The first time, her mind raced to the power outage, the bills, Emily's busy life. But she kept at it, day after day, the chaos softening. A free app from the library taught her to let go, and soon, a late mail delivery didn't rattle her. "It's just mail," she shrugged, a peace settling in. Stress wasn't her master anymore, it was a guest she could send away. Her telomeres, she hoped, were thanking her. Appetite and weight needed care, not force. The CDC warned of nutrient loss, so Clara got practical. She cooked small meals: chicken soup with carrots, oatmeal with berries, foods she'd loved but forgotten. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, her stomach waking up. A nutritionist's blog suggested protein to hold her weight: Greek yogurt, a handful of almonds. She gained a pound, then 2, her sweater fitting better. "I'm feeding myself again," she smiled, stirring a pot on the stove. It wasn't about stuffing herself, it was about nourishing what she'd neglected, giving her body a reason to stick around. Social connections were the final piece, and Clara felt the CDC's 50% warning like a call to arms. She picked up the phone and dialed Margaret. "Fancy a walk tomorrow?" she asked, her voice shy but firm. Margaret's yes was instant, and the next day, they strolled the park, her dog sniffing every bush. Clara laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months. Then she called Emily, planning a visit. "Bring your hiking boots," she teased. She even tracked down her old book club, showing up with a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. The room buzzed with familiar faces, warm coffee, stories. "I've missed this," she admitted, her heart full. Connection wasn't just nice, it was life, and she was weaving it back in. Weeks turned into months, and by spring 2026, Clara was a different woman. At 70, she walked to the park daily, her pace brisker 0.9 meters per second. She'd clocked it with a grin. She opened jars with a twist, slept 7 hours straight, balanced on one leg like a pro. She danced, she breathed, she ate, she laughed. Her garden bloomed brighter than ever, and one sunny afternoon, she planted a new row of tulips red and fierce to mark her rebirth. She stood back, hands on her hips, and felt it. Strength, not just in her body, but in her soul. The mirror showed a woman with brighter eyes, fuller cheeks, a spark reignited. Clara didn't know how many years she had left, no one does. But she knew this. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, really living, every step, every squeeze, every night a testament to her fight. Those 8 signs had been a wake-up call, and she'd answered with everything she had. So here's my question for you. What's one thing you've learned from Clara's journey that you could bring into your life? Maybe it's a walk, a call, a deep breath. Drop it in the comments below. I'd love to hear it. And if her stories touched you, share it with someone you love. Because at the end of the day, it's not just about how long we live, it's about how well. Clara's proof of that, and maybe, just maybe, you can be too.